Hello, Carl.
Michael Kitces. Michael Kitces. Let me just ask you, because we've all been wondering this whole time. Where'd that little small version of Michael that's sitting on the shelf behind you?
Oh,
Where did
this
that guy come from?
this little guy. This little guy came from Mark Friedenthal, who runs Tolerisk, so risk tolerant software. So,
Oh, wow.
I
Shout out to
for
Mark.
yeah, I forget like the full context of it, but like he was doing these like mini, it's like a mini Lego figurine. He was doing these like little Lego figurine giveaways for something. And I guess like one of the ones that he got had like black pants, a blue shirt, and a tie. And he was like, if I just put some glasses and goatee on, it's like Michael Kitces. So if you look closely at it, he inked on a goatee. Like the goatee
Wow.
and the glasses are drawn to
Mhm.
make it work. And then he gave it to me in an event because he was very amused, as was I. So I thought that had to be a keeper. So now he just rides on the shelf there.
Thank you for clearing that up. I've been wondering for a year and a half what the heck that little thing was.
Yes, it is a little blue shirt, goatee, glasses Lego figure.
Nice. Nice. Well, what are we? I mean, I have questions about everything in the background, but we'll say I'll just do one a week. I'll do one a
Okay,
week. So
that's
that was
fair.
that was this week. So okay. What are we talking about today?
What are we talk about today? So maybe like a little bit of an extension of the last episode we did. We were talking about the dynamics of what happens as you're coming into an advisory firm. Do advisors have an obligation to create new jobs and career tracks? And like, can you just do a simple residency where they go in a few years, or do you always have to like hire so they're going to be your future successor? So I had a question now come in from, I guess, basically the
Hmm.
other end of that sequence, which
Right.
is an advisor. We'll call him Jim. So Jim's question was, I've been working at this advisory firm for a number of years. I've been interested in buying out the like founder CEO, but the price demands are too high in my opinion. I think the industry may have some kind of discount for internal successions. And so I guess sort of as Jim put it, I'm wondering like, is there a standard discount for internal successions, or just more broadly, like, should internal successions have a discount given the lack of affordability?
Wow. There's a lot.
There's a lot there. I mean, this is a
Yeah.
discussion that's cropping up a lot these days, as
Yeah.
per our discussion last week, like more advisors approaching the age of retirement and looking to retire and successor out. So, we hired people 5 to 10 years ago to be our successors. Now some of those bells are ringing. It's like, so it's time, right? And everybody thinks like, though, this is cool. We're all on track on succession until we sit down and have to set a price.
Yeah.
And then you really find out whether a buyer and a seller can agree on a price.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think um that the idea of a discount for internal succession is really interesting to me because the only way that works, though, it's not, again, it's not a should, it's not an obligation. It's, and it reminds me a little bit of at one point, we lived in a house that we rented for 5 years. And the people who rented it to us had sold a business for a silly amount of money. We
Mm-hmm.
knew they were super busy. And they called and said, "Hey, this was totally out of the blue. Hey, we're getting a divorce. We need to sell the house in 60 days."
Oh.
Now, I don't know that I felt a little bit like I should get a discount because I paid 5 years of rent. I certainly felt that, but as soon as I came to my senses, I realized, well, I mean, I got what I paid for. I got the house to live in while I rented. So I started thinking about what, I know this house better than anybody else. I wonder if there's an offer I could make that reflects the idea that like no due diligence, no inspection, no real estate agent, quick close, and that maybe given the life circumstances that people were, and was fair, like a fair like I actually went through, I remember going through like what is each one of those worth.
Yeah.
It's pretty easy to calculate the no real estate commissions, but what is it worth that you don't have to think about paint and carpet and getting it ready to show? What is it worth that you don't have to worry about whether something comes up in the inspection? Like I tried to put a number on each of those and make an argument, and they bought it. Given their situation, like there was a value on their end of like, hey, this will happen quick. We won't have, it's no fuss. We got a lot going on right now. And so to me, that's like maybe a decent metaphor for the idea of like, well, maybe there's a way to structure a deal that reflects some of the value that you could um negotiate with is not necessarily the right word, but it is the right word, because you have an understanding of the business already.
Yeah.
Maybe the sale would be easier. Maybe somebody doesn't have to deal with due diligence and earnouts. And like there may be a way to structure a deal that reflects the value already built in because you're internal. But that's totally different than should and standard. How do you feel about that?
I I like that. So look, so the primary challenge for any seller of an advisory firm is the risk that the deal doesn't go through and or the risk that clients don't fully follow, which has some financial consequences.
Mhm.
Advisory firms get cut, transactions get cut with a wide range of deals from what's basically like a revenue sharing earnout where everybody has skin in the game all the way through to recently like deals that are much more upfront where maybe a seller can see as much as like 60-80% basically upfront and just the last 20 to 40% that's subject to some kind of contingency. Let's make sure a reasonable portion of the clients actually come over in the deal. But you maximize your value as a seller when you get a good deal fit where the clients actually go. Because if the clients don't want to go and they're going to freak out and bolt, either you're not going to get the deal done or they're not going to sign the paperwork to repaper the advisory agreements, or you're going to get tagged on a contingency payment or something else bad is going to happen. All of which is to say, look, there is some benefit for a founder to be able to successor internally, assuming you just otherwise like the advisor that you brought up in the firm. They know the clients, they know the service expectations, they're presumably delivering them at a reasonable level because you've kept them on board and you're having this conversation about succession with them. And that does fundamentally provide some incremental reduction to the risk of the deal, which I could argue economically probably would have some kind of discount associated with it, but probably not at the level that Jim is envisioning.
Yeah, separate problem is just the owner
Yeah.
in the owner's view of value, which is a problem we should just definitely address, of course. But yeah, separate
Yeah.
problem.
But I mean, just even when I think about what this might look like, again, like if some high flying, unfortunately PE funded, but they have a lot of cash, like if some high flying, well funded firm is willing to give me as much as 80% upfront with no risk, and I have seen some deals cut that high.
Right.
And realistically, if I put in a good effort on this transition, most clients are probably going to go if I just come to this positively and talk up the deal. Like, to me, at least, maybe I'm reading too much into it from some other conversations I've had with some other advisors, but I've heard at least Jim didn't give a number, but I've heard other people in Jim's kind of position say, like, well, I would expect something like a 20 to 30% discount.
Mm.
I'm like, you're not defraying the risk that much. Like, could I make the case for a 5% discount? Okay. Right. So like saving the commission on the realtor with the private sale, like we don't have to list it and I don't have to do the song and dance with a bunch of vendors, a bunch of buyers, and I know you're a good fit and we can just get right to the paperwork and like this simplifies a little. So can I make some case for like a 5 or 10%
Hmm.
internal succession? Maybe. But
Hmm.
beyond that, like, I feel a lot of sympathy for the buyer, and I want to come back to Jim in a moment. But from the seller's end, like, you built this business and full enterprise value of it. Like, you're allowed to get your enterprise value.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there are enough buyers out there that, like, someone will write you a pretty good check
Yeah.
for your enterprise value without even doing your internal succession thing. They got
Yeah.
advisors, they'll take your clients, they'll transition them to their advisors. You'll help with it because you want to get paid.
Yeah.
And a lot of those deals happen and they go pretty okay. It's sort of, I think, a version, Carl, of the story you used to tell of, like, I sold my practice and it turned out no one cried.
Yeah, John Bowen said to me, "Your biggest disappointment in your career is going to be when you sell your business. Nobody's going to cry but you."
And
You know,
and so you know, I do feel an inclination, much love to our next generation. Again, I want to come back to them in a moment, but uh I don't think any firm owner should have an obligation to sell at a below market value to their next generation advisor. It's kind of a version of the discussion that we had last week. Like, I would love to see firms create opportunities for the next generation, but I don't think they have an obligation to hire people into jobs they don't want. And I would love to see firms get transitioned to next generation advisors, but I don't think a founder has an obligation to take a below market rate on the sale of their firm in order to do that. You might choose to take something slightly below market because it's a lower risk deal. Your more confident clients will be served the way you want them to be served because you brought that advisor up to do that. And that's important to you. Not everybody's primary goal in an exit is just get, like, the absolute biggest dollar.
right.
Sometimes other factors like continuity for clients, continuity of service. If I sell the big guys, they're going to obliterate my firm's name and out of existence. And if I successor this, my successor wants to keep our firm name and our presence in the community, which is important to me because I'm going to be retired, but I still live in this community. I just kind of still like to have the firm out there that everybody knows in town that I made. Like, we have a lot of preferences beyond just price. And if you want to trade off some price preferences for some other preferences, like, more power to you. Make your own decision. But this
Yeah.
kind of implication of uh firm owners should have an obligation to sell at a below market rate because their next generation can't afford it. I don't think that's the firm owner's obligation.
Yeah, and like you said, we want to return back to the buyer in this
Yes.
story because deep empathy. You know what I mean? Like this is a really hard problem. A
Now,
really hard problem.
the note I will make from the successors end, like from the next generation advisors end, is I've had a number of advisors that have come with deals like this and even show some, like, the here's the terms of what I'm getting. And I've looked at them like, dude, you're getting a better deal than I did when I bought into my firm as a partner 15 years ago. You actually have a good price, like a really good price, but you've never founded a firm or run a P&L, and you're not so risk inclined, which is why you took a job in someone else's firm instead of hanging a shingle like the founder person did. So I understand you have a much lower tolerance for risk, which makes this number scarier, but it's not actually that the price is not reasonable. It's that you got a risk tolerance decision to
Yeah.
make.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, I really don't think a firm owner owes it to you to discount the price to a price that fits your risk tolerance. That's really not their obligation. But maybe we can do a little conversation and an education about the economics of how advisory firms actually work and why this might actually be a pretty darn good deal for you. And sorry, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, and what about the times that we run into, which is even hard to imagine right now in this kind of semi-frothy environment that we live in. But there are plenty of times when it actually is a bad deal, right? Like where
Oh, yes.
the
I've
firm
seen some
owner's
horrific
perception,
ones.
yeah, the firm's owner's perception of value
So,
is way off kilter.
so let's talk about that for a moment, because the really, I find these are sort of opposite sides of the same coin. So the traditional rule of thumb in our advisor world was that advisory firms sell for 2 times revenue. That was like the benchmark. RIAs with recurring AUM fees. That was the benchmark for like the better part of 15 years. That number has crept up recently, depending on who you talk to. It's closer to 2.5. Some people talk about 3x, although if you really start getting a deal, like there's a bunch of contingencies and asterisks to that. That's not like you get that check free and clear. There's a lot loaded up on that. Your free and clear numbers tend to be a little lower, but call it I'll call it two times revenue just because it makes some of the math nice and round and easy, and maybe come back in a moment to valuations being a little bit higher lately. So mid-sized advisory firms were selling for 2 times revenue for a long time. And if you look at most of the industry benchmarking studies throughout the 2000s and 2010s, advisory firms were running about 25 to 30% profit margins on average, plus or minus the good year and the bad year, but we would tend to hover there. So if my firm runs 25 to 30% profit margins and I'm selling for 2 times revenue, that basically means I'm selling for something right around 7 to 8 times earnings. If I have a 25% profit margin, I multiply it by 8, I'm up to 200% of revenue, which is known as 2x revenue. All these deals really were generally selling for something around 7 to 8 times profits. And much smaller firms, it looks a little different when you buy a solo practice because you have a much bigger take home with very little staff infrastructure. But once you got basically past solo practices, that was kind of the neighborhood. If it was a smaller firm and a little riskier, maybe you were in like the 4 to 6 times earnings range instead of 7 or 8, and big firms went for a little bit more. And because that was the math, the common way that a lot of deals got done was something on the order of 10 or 20% down and a 7-year note. If I put 10 or 20% down, what I was buying for about 8 times earnings is now 7 times earnings. And if I finance 7 times earnings over 7 years, my profits pay my note every year.
Right.
It cash flows. Now, not perfectly, because A, I may have needed to come a little bit out of pocket for the down payment, and B, because welcome to the tax dynamics of a purchase, the profits are taxable. Your purchase of the business is mostly principal plus a little bit of interest. Principal is not deductible when you buy the practice. So you're basically you're taking pre-tax profits, but you only get to buy with after-tax profits, which meant usually you would be a little bit more out of pocket the first year, maybe the first 2 years. And by the time you got 2 or 3 years worth of new clients and market growth, you were definitely cash flow break even. And then you would actually be cash flow positive in years like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then the 8th year, the note gets paid off and your income goes through the roof because all of your principal payments just went away, and now you're cranking. So the traditional version of these deals self-cash flowed from profits. And the reality is, for a lot of these sort of mid-sized-ish firms of, I think, the size that Jim is talking about here, they're still not materially different than these numbers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if maybe now it's pushing a little more towards 8 times revenue more consistently, and the firm's not running at 25% margins, it's running at 30% margins, and 30% margins times 8 times earnings would be 2.4 times revenue. That's why that number's crept up a little bit. But still, if you can get to a down payment and financing over 7 years, you're pretty close. Again, pull it out with your tax calculator and your marginal tax rate. You're going to be slightly underwater because the after-tax earnings don't quite cover the note because of the tax drag, but you'll be there in a year or two, and you keep going from there. So the deals aren't actually that far off. And I highlight this because I saw a version of this recently where an advisor was really upset that they were going to have to pay 2 times revenue. And it was for a fairly small practice. It was basically like the senior advisor, like the founder person, the associate advisor who was the heir apparent, and an admin person. The practice was clearing like 60 to 70 cents on the dollar. just like cash on cash. And I was like, if you get to buy at 2 times revenue, like you're going to pay this off in 3 years of profits once the founder is gone and you get all the salary that he was previously paying to himself. Like if he'll finance this, or you can just go get a bank financing note, like you'll be cash flow positive the day it closes.
Mhm.
Because you're paying 3 times earnings financed over 7 years. Like this is amazingly cash flow good. And the advisor was very focused on, well, everybody else pays 2x. I'm an associate. I should get a discount. And it's like, you're getting the discount. This is an amazing deal at 3 times profits.
Yeah.
And all the clients you've got relationships, like they're gonna stick around. Now,
Mhm.
the flip side of this, Carl, kind of getting your comment earlier, I knew another firm many years ago that was doing a version of this. The talking point was, I really want to support our next generation advisors, so we're going to take a 25% haircut, and everybody got to buy in at 1.5 times revenue instead of 2x.
Oh,
And the problem from the founder was that all of his associate advisors kept leaving and not buying in. And he'd been through like 3 or 4 of them over the span of a couple of years. Basically said, because this was a mid-sized firm, there were multiple advisors. He's like, I made like the whole farm system and all the people to be successors. And like none of them want to take the deal at 1.5 times revenue. I'm giving them this gift and no one wants to take it, which in his context was basically a prelude to young people these days. And as I got into, I like started asking him some questions about how the firm worked and what the numbers were. What it eventually came down to was, he was a giver. So the good news of being a giver was that he was very comfortable to take a haircut on his valuation. The bad news of being a giver was he had a ginormous number of unprofitable clients that he had said yes to over the years that he
mm,
shouldn't have, and a whole bunch of clients that had various stories that meant they got exceptions on their fee schedule. So he was way below market rate on his fees, and the
mhm,
firm was barely running a 10% profit margin.
mm,
Now, it had a few $1 million of revenue. So he didn't care. It's like I make 10 per, I forget exactly what his numbers were, but like I make 11% on $3 million of revenue. I'm making $330,000 a year. It is more than enough to pay my bills and live my lifestyle and enjoy what I do. And I've got enterprise value, so it'll cover my retirement. It's like, why do I need to jack up my fees or kick out that low end clients and all those things that the industry says you're supposed to do? I make hundreds of thousands of dollars and I've got a multi-million-dollar business. What's the problem? And the problem was, every one of his associate advisors sat down and was like, yeah, it sounds great that you're getting 1.5 times revenue until you do the math and you're like, it's 13 times profits.
right, right.
And no one wanted to buy at 13 times profits because that would actually obliterate their personal income. Like now you are horribly cash flow negative
Yeah.
on this deal. And so even just air quotes, just taking a 25% haircut wasn't enough, because this is sort of the grand caveat of the industry's kind of fixate. I was going to say fixation. That's probably too hard of a word. But like our reliance on the multiple of revenue rule of thumb. Nobody buys at the end of the day on a multiple of revenue. You buy on cash flow, and that the cash flow works for the buyer and the seller. Well, mostly for the buyer. Now, depending on the buyer and their circumstances, a multiple of revenue may get them to a number that works good enough that they don't have to get further into the details. But on the one hand, it means sometimes people are getting great deals and don't realize it. My friend that was basically getting a like 3 times revenue buy-in and didn't realize it.
Mhm,
And the firm owner that couldn't figure out why no one would buy his firm at 1.5 times revenue. And the answer was because it's like 13 times profits and it's horribly unprofitable.
mm,
And this is why profit margins, one of the reasons why profit margins matter. So, so on the one hand, like when I hear people say this in the purest sense, like, do I think internal succession plans should be discounted for lack of affordability? I really don't. I don't think our firm owners have an obligation to take a below market rate. But I often see firm owners that are very disillusioned about, or like need to be disillusioned, I should say, about the value of their firm because they're clinging to a multiple of revenue that's not really a fair reflection given how not high margins they actually run. And I've also seen people on the other end who are not as accustomed to the math, finances, profitability of advisory firms, and maybe are a little bit more risk averse because that's why they took an employee job, who don't realize that they're actually getting a pretty darn good deal on the table.
Mm-hmm.
And that your reluctance to do the deal is not because you're getting an unfair valuation, it's because you're having a risk tolerance moment,
Yeah.
which is also a fair reason to be concerned, but firm owners not on an obligation to discount for your risk tolerance. You've got to decide whether you want to take the risk.
Yeah. Hey, rapid fire style.
Yeah.
If I'm one of these younger associate advisors that wants to buy a firm, where are the 1 to 3 best places? Because what strikes me here is like, man, a decision like this, you should be really, really educated.
Yeah.
Like if you understood all this, then the conversation is much different for you.
Yep.
Where are the 1 to 3 places you would go to educate yourself if you're in this situation?
So the primary places, well, so I'm a reader, I'm a book person. So my primary two places would be there's two good books that I think give really good orientations around this. They're a tiny bit dated, which just means some of the multiples they might talk about maybe aren't perfect reflections of where we are now in the industry, but the underlying mechanics, the math, how all this stuff works, I think is very dead on. So the first is um it's literally called How to Value, Buy, or Sell a Financial Advisory Practice
Hmm.
by Mark Tibergien and Owen Dahl. It's almost 20 years old. It's still very, very, very good. The second is called Buying, Selling, and Valuing Financial Practices. And it's by David Grau Sr., who founded FP Transitions.
Hmm.
I think both of those give really good educations on just the economic math and realities of how advisory firms work. Valuations have crept up slightly from where they are, although if you're not buying like a multi-billion-dollar firm, they're actually not that different. Most of the increases in valuation are for the really, really big firms, not the small to mid-sized ones. Uh, and probably the biggest asterisk for those books relative to the marketplace today, even 8 years ago when David Grau was writing his book, there were almost no banks that did any financing for this. Like if you wanted the whole 7-year finance thing, you had to get the seller to give you a seller financed note. There are a lot of banks that do this now, specifically in the advisor space, that know how to underwrite it. Some are tied to SBA, some are not. So there's a lot of bank financing options, which just make this easier. It means the seller can get their lump sum because the bank cuts the check,
Right.
and the buyer can get the financing because they make the payments to the bank. Because one of the tensions historically was the sellers like, I think it's a good practice, but like I don't really want to have to take your I don't want my retirement to depend on your personal household financial capabilities.
Yeah.
And so bank financing has made that a little bit easier. But those are the big two books that I would look at. I think they're very good for getting educated on the economics of how this stuff works.
You know what's interesting to me about this is that the impact on your life that could come from reading 2 books.
Yeah.
Like it's
Uh-huh.
so interesting that like the number of people who are willing to read those 2 books is very, very low.
Yes.
But the impact is huge. Like if you're in this, I just it's interesting to me how quickly you can become
Yeah.
in the upper tier
Hmm.
of, and I'm not talking 80%. I'm like 80%, like you can be 80% educated about something pretty quick, and most of us won't do it.
Yeah.
And so it strikes me that like, man, if I was thinking about this,
Yeah. The
I would buy 2 books.
the other thing I would note around this, you know, Grau's book in particular makes a particularly strong case that the way most firms, I was going to say need to do this or should do this, in internal successions in particular is you don't make these all or nothing transactions where the stakes are really high and your next generation may be a little bit more risk averse and doesn't want to take on like a ginormous like multi-million-dollar note at once, which is what this sometimes comes out to be. uh you do it in slices, you do it in tranches is their label. So let's do a transaction for 5 or 10% of the firm, and then 3 years from now we'll do another 10 or 20% of the firm, and then 3 years after that we'll do everything that's left. And the reasons for that are sort of twofold. One, just we all get a little bit more comfortable with how these economics and note payments work with numbers that are a little bit lower stakes than like you've never had much more than a car loan before, and now you're supposed to take out a multi-million-dollar banknote to finance the purchase of a practice. Like you can ease into the comfort of borrowing and getting cash flows from it a little bit more effectively in a world where if there's a bad year, you don't blow up your personal balance sheet because you're only on the hook for a smaller percentage. But as those deals work out, because again, as I noted earlier, like the firm continues to grow through this. So you don't even have to fully pay off the notes to be cash flow positive. Usually by a few years in with some incremental growth, you're already cash flow positive. It gets better once the note pays off. So when you do this in multiple tranches over time, what happens is the buyer who's coming in, by the time you're getting to the big purchase at the end, now they might own 20, 30, 40% of the firm, and they have the profits and cash flows from 20, 30, 40% of the firm plus growth for the past couple of years, makes it much, much easier to cash flow the remaining purchase than I've never had a loan. I just live on a salary, and now I'm supposed to take like this giant loan all at once to do a giant purchase. Or maybe it even requires a down payment that I don't have to down payment 10% and finance the rest. So Grau makes a strong case around doing this in tranches. A lot of firms do valuations with FP transitions, and they have some additional detail there about how you price and do the tranches over time. But I personally, I think it's an underrated strategy. I mean, the FP transition speaks of it highly. Just I don't see it done as much as perhaps it should or would help with this, because just it makes the math a little easier and more incremental. It lets the buyer build up to this over time, so it's not a giant borrowing at once. There's some niceties for the seller who sometimes is a little worried. Like, I don't know that, like, I'm kind of getting close to the point that I want to retire, but it's hard for sellers. It's like, I keep bringing on clients, the market keeps going up. Like, if I just hung out 2 more years, I would make a lot more money and I could sell it 2 years from now, which is one of the reasons why a lot of successors get dangled along with like, I'm ready to retire in 3 years. 3 years later, like, no, now it's really 3 years. 3 years later, like, no, now it's really, really 3 years. And then successors like, forget it, I'm out of here. I can't keep waiting. It happens from the founder's end because it's really hard to not hang on for a few more years because your asset keeps growing. And this to me is a little bit of have your cake and eat it too. Like you start selling some and taking some chips off the table. You get to participate in some upside as it goes. From the buyer's end, you get some at today's price. You get some at future price. So today's price is basically a better deal than future price with more growth. So the whole like, I don't want to have to make the growth and then buy my own growth in the future. Well, no, you're buying some now, and then everybody shifts incrementally over time, right? So the classic deal. If everybody feels like it's not quite ideal for them, that probably means it was a fair deal for both parties.
Right. That's amazing. Masterclass. Thanks, Michael.
Awesome. Thank you, Carl.
Cheers. Yeah.